Thanks very much indeed, Daryl, for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the work you're doing through SARCS to bring these issues to a wider audience. And thanks to all of you for coming along this evening to hear more about the topic, should Christians be vegan? I've spent about the last 10 years or so drafting those 2 volumes of On Animals that Daryl mentioned, and at the end of that process I'm really enthusiastic about getting out as widely as possible to Christian audiences to talk about the key findings of the project. And one way of describing or picturing my key conclusion to the project is like this. Well, perhaps that needs a little bit more explanation. There is an abyss, as you see. The abyss is between the kinds of treatment of animals that seems to me obviously demanded by a Christian understanding of their place in God's purposes on one side of the abyss, and on the other, the way we're treating them at the moment. This abyss is huge. It seems to me there's a scandalous gap between the place of animals in a Christian understanding and a Christian faith-based understanding and our practices today, particularly in our use of animals for food. And so that's what I want to convince you of this evening. If you're not already convinced, I want to spend some time talking about why this is an important issue for Christians among so many others pressing on our attention. What are the specific Christian faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals? A brief survey of what we're doing to other animals in our use of them for food. Asking what are the key practical responses in response to acknowledging this abyss. Acknowledging some complexities, the way in which our use of animals for food is interlinked with other really important human justice and environmental issues, and then talking about the next practical steps you could take if you're convinced that this is an issue that needs some attention. So let's jump in. Why this issue? Now, obviously, there are very many other really important pressing issues that we could be taking up and we should be taking up. And you may have your own lists. A Christian engagement with anti-racist and support for refugees and migrants seems to me a really important issue. There are people suffering from famine in places in sub-Saharan Africa and Yemen that demand our attention. No one can be unaware of the challenge of the climate catastrophe that we're currently on track to create through business as usual operations of our economy and consumption practices. So how in this kind of context can I make the case for attending to animals and diet? Well, I want to say there are 3 reasons why we ought to be concerned about animals in particular, even in this context. First of all, urgency. Second of all, our ability to multitask ethically. And third, the intersections between animals, humans, and the environment. My case for the urgency is, I think, most clearly pictured in this these 2 charts, which gripped me when I came across the statistics behind them. So in 1900, we'd so far expanded our production of meat and animal products and our raising of domesticated animals that the combined biomass, so the combined weight of all the domesticated animals on Earth, outweighed that of wild land mammals by 3.5 times. So by 1900, there were 3.5 times more domesticated animals by mass than wild land mammals. In the intervening 100 years, we nearly quadrupled the numbers of domesticated animals, and that was one of the chief causes for a halving in the biomass of wild land mammals. So by the time we get to 2000, there are 24 times more domesticated animals by mass than wild animals on Earth. So it seems once you start to take account of what we're doing to these vast numbers of domesticated animals and the impacts that's having on the wild animals, it seems to me really clear that this is an urgent issue that demands our attention in the scale and immensity of our practice in relation to farmed animals and the fact that if we don't address this soon, there'll be virtually no wild animals to be talking about. Second of all, we need to address this because we can multitask ethically. We can engage with anti-racism, we can engage with gender equality, we can engage with climate change, and we can engage with animals. We don't have to choose between them. I'm not saying this should be taking all of our time and attention. And finally, we need to attend to the ways in which we can only address some issues of human social justice and environmental well-being through attending to what we're doing to farmed animals. So some of the worst jobs in the world at the moment are working in abattoirs and meat packing plants. In the US, workers in those plants are disproportionately likely to be black, Latinx, migrant, undocumented. In this country, 2/3 of workers in slaughterhouses are EU migrants. These are jobs that no one wants because they subject workers to very high levels of physical injury, mental trauma that's analogous to PTSD in many cases, and there's a very high turnover of staff and so on. And it seems to me this is a really good example of almost all the time we're doing nasty things to animals, we're doing nasty things to humans in relation to them. And I'll talk about other issues of that kind of intersection a bit later. So why should other animals matter to Christians in particular? Why should Christians be concerned about this? Well, in On Animals Volume 1, I divide up an engagement with a Christian understanding of animals under 3 major headings of Christian doctrine or teaching: a doctrine of creation, a doctrine of reconciliation, thinking about the work of God in Jesus Christ, and doctrine of redemption, what God is bringing creation to. So let me try a 5-minute summary of that Volume 1. So under doctrine of creation, I think it's first of all really important to recognize that Christian theology makes the strong countercultural claim that creation is good, that we worship a good God who makes creatures and declares them good. So we're not finding ourselves in an environment which is neutral. We are affirming that the creation as we experience it, the creatures we find around us, are the good creatures of a good God. And that was controversial for the first Christian theologians who were making that case. It's still controversial. One of the reasons you might find people give for not believing in God is that the world is an awful place. How could a good God be in charge of this? And that requires a Christian account of the fall and how creation has departed from the goodness that God created for it. But that fundamental affirmation that the animals we find among us and the animals we're dealing with are the good creatures of the God that we worship is a fundamental reference point for a Christian engagement with animals. It ought to give Christians a radical concern for these fellow creatures. These are the creatures that our scriptures tell us that God made, God loved into being. God has intimate provision for care for the creatures in their flourishing glorify God, their creator. And these are creatures that we should be fundamentally concerned with. It goes as basic for me as a Christian affirmation of a doctrine of monotheism, a worship of one God. We don't believe there's a God that's specific to the human species Homo sapiens. We worship a God who is the God of every creature, the God who brought the whole universe into being. How could we possibly have a vision of our relationship with the rest of creation that neglected that fundamental insight that we worship the God who is the God of all creatures? Now, perhaps you, like many Christians, will say, okay, David, a doctrine of creation gives us grounds for being concerned about animals. But by the time we get to thinking about Jesus and God's work in Jesus Christ, doesn't everything collapse back to the human? Don't we understand what's happening in Jesus Christ as God becoming human for the sake of human sin in order to redeem human beings? Well, we have told the story that way, but we've got really good reasons for a much wider understanding of what God is doing in Jesus Christ. And so we need to attend to what Darrell picks up in the very term sarx through the name of his organization. When John is reaching for a fundamental description of what happens in the incarnation, John's gospel says the Word became flesh. And flesh is this messy, body, bloody, muscly stuff that's common to us and other animals. A little later in John's Gospel, John 3:16 explains that God's motivation for the incarnation, and John says that God so loved the world that God sent God's only beloved Son. The world, the cosmos in Greek. And so it's God's love for the whole of the cosmos that motivates the incarnation. And if we think about the first accounts of Christology, how in the epistles, the writers of those epistles make sense of what's happening in Jesus Christ. The opening of the letter to the Colossians and the Ephesians say that God became human in Christ to reconcile all things in heaven and earth to God, gathering up all things. In Colossians, that's repeated 5 or 6 times, tapanta in Greek, all things. And so the earliest Christian visions of God's work of Jesus Christ were inclusive in that kind of way. The end of Mark's Gospel says Jesus sends his disciples to preach the gospel to all creation. And yet so often we've constrained and reduced the impact. And it seems to me that in the context of those majestic visions that were picked up by later Christian theologians, it seems a strangely blinkered underestimate of what God is doing in Christ to think that God has only to do with human beings. And these 2 paintings from a wonderful series by Stanley Spencer called Christ in the Wilderness, picturing Jesus at peace with wild animals as a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that the lion will lie down with the lamb. Another memorable one in the series that you can find online has Jesus cradling a scorpion in the palm of his hand. And then you might say, well, okay, creation and reconciliation, we can see where the rest of creation fits in, David. But by the time we get to a doctrine of redemption, doesn't everything come down to the human again? Well, no. We sometimes have told a Christian story of redemption as a select group of human souls being teleported out of their bodies to drift around with angels in a cloudy heaven. But for a Christian vision, both biblically and in later theological tradition, of what God is doing in redemption is much broader than that. Have a look at this painting by the American Quaker Edward Hicks of the peaceable kingdom. And here he's trying to give an artist's impression of the Isaiah 11 prophecy of the lion lying down with the lamb. And you could picture him seeing peace between humans and other creatures on the right-hand side of the picture, and peace between colonial invaders and indigenous peoples on the left. And that's representative of a broad engagement by Christian theologians, recognizing that what God has reason to create, God has reason to redeem. That God doesn't bring creatures into being just to discard them at the end of times. And if we look at the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, we can find strong affirmations that what's happening in the worship of the Lamb gathered in the new creation is every creature in heaven and earth, according to Revelation, is gathered in joint praise of Jesus Christ, the Lamb standing as if slain in the center. So it's in the context of passages like that, it's really remarkable that we have constrained our vision and developed some versions of theology that suggest that God is only interested in the human in the context of the doctrine of creation. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, I'm particularly proud to own as a Methodist local preacher, preached a great sermon on Romans 8 called The General Deliverance, where he said nothing is more express than that animals will be released from this groaning creation. And Wesley saw that had important implications for responding to the cruelties that he saw being exercised on the animals in his day. It's really clear that Christians have, for a very long time, recognized that Christian faith and understandings of holiness has implications beyond the human. These are just 3 images of stories of the saints. St. Macarius, who healed the hyena's pup. St. Godric, who lived in a little hermitage in Durham, near where I used to live, and was a proto-hunt saboteur, hiding a stag in his hermitage and telling the Prince Bishops he didn't lie. The Prince Bishop's hunt comes up to St. Godric and they said, "Have you seen the stag we're chasing?" And Godric says, "God knows where he is." And then the hunters go off. And then where I live at the moment, St. Werburg, the patron saint of Chester, resurrected a goose who her steward had killed when she was giving hospitality to a bunch of geese. So Christians took up these biblical visions of peace between humans and other creatures and recognized that they were important to sort of record as manifestations of Christian holiness. Okay, so we've got that understanding of where animals belong in Christian doctrines of creation, reconciliation, and redemption in those stories of the saints. On the one hand, we now need to look at what we're doing to other animals on the other. So a very brief survey of what we're doing to other animals. This is a satellite image of the ocean. The black dots that you can see on it are industrial trawler vessels. The reason they're leaving those long trails is because they're dragging heavy booms which are dragging along this ocean bottom on these huge tall nets all in a row, and they're basically doing oceanic clear cutting, doing astonishing damage to the whole ocean, not just the target species that they're trying to catch. That's what modern industrial fishing looks like. That's why in the 20th century we fished out of the oceans 90% of the fish. We often neglect fish in our understanding of what we're doing to other animals for food, but fish, wild-caught fish, are one of the few animals we don't even bother to slaughter. Instead, we just allow them to asphyxiate slowly on the decks of trawler vessels, and there's really good, increasing scientific evidence that that is a painful and suffering-inducing experience for fish. So fish we need to attend to. The next most numerous animal we're farming is broiler chickens, the vast majority of which are raised in huge sheds like this. We've completely re-engineered the bodies of chickens so they put on weight so quickly that they could be slaughtered at 35 days of old while they're still babies. They're putting on weight so quickly that their immature legs can't support these unwieldy bodies, and so they experience significant suffering and distress, especially in the latter period of their life in these crowded places before they're gathered up roughly, shoved into crates and taken to places of slaughter. Egg-laying hens often have it really bad. The caged hens are now illegal in the EU, but battery cages are still the most common way of raising laying hens globally. And in the EU, we still have a colony cage system where cages are stacked in indoor warehouses. Those hens have a laying life of about 18 months before they're killed for pet food. Here's an image of what intensive pig farming looks like. I got my first sight of this in December in a UK context, which looked, I wasn't taking pictures, but it looked very much like that. So crowded conditions. The pigs have their tails cut off because otherwise they'd be chewing each other's tails out of sheer boredom. Pigs are very socially engaged, intelligent animals that so positioning them in these impoverished lives is really cruel and unkind. Other issues in relation to sheep. Live export is a big deal in relation to Australia and New Zealand and long journeys by sea, but even in this country sheep are castrated without anaesthetic and transported for long distances. Increasing numbers of dairy cattle don't even get to graze grass, have their calves taken away without even meeting them and without even suckling for the first time, and increasing numbers of beef cattle are being raised in the UK. This is a UK farm where beef cattle are being sort of finished on a corn-fed diet in a way that's modelling US patterns of intensive agriculture. So it seems to me, I've rushed through that, but it seems to me that there's very strong reasons for recognising a scandalous gap between the kind of regard and respect that we ought to be having for fellow creatures of God, fellow animal creatures of God, according to a Christian understanding of their place in God's purposes, and the way in which we're treating them at the moment. So what should we do differently in response? It seems to me unarguable that in the context of those challenges, we need to reduce our consumption of animal products and move to higher welfare sourcing for any animals that we're continuing to consume. We need to reduce consumption because that's the only way to improve farmed animal welfare. We can't make lives of animals better without raising many fewer of them. But also because that would help address the problem of the mass extinction of wild animals that I referred to earlier through habitat loss, through direct pasture and the crops we're growing for farmed animals. So we need to do it for the animals, we need to do it for the environment. So raising livestock is a major contributor to climate change. It's one of the key steps we could take in relation to climate catastrophe to change what we're eating towards a plant-based diet. But we also need to do it for human reasons too. At the moment, we're feeding over a third of global cereal output to animals. The efficiency of doing that rather than eating the grains ourselves is about 8%. So you kind of throw a third of our cereal crops towards animals, and you only get 8% back of the calories and nutrition. So even if you were only concerned about human food security, you would be very worried about that. And then there are other problems in relation to water security, human health, the kind of zoonotic diseases like swine flu and bird flu that get incubated in industrial farming conditions, and a growing problem of antibiotic resistance. In the US, 80% of antibiotics are being fed to farmed animals, so it's not surprising that we're incubating bacterial strains which are becoming untreatable with the current methods. So it's obvious that we need to reduce consumption, and then we need, for any animals we're continuing to raise, we need to move them to higher welfare sourcing where they can flourish in lives that are recognizable in their particularity as creatures of God. But isn't it more complicated than that? Isn't it more complicated than those two obvious priorities? Well, in a sense it is. What we're doing to farmed animals connects, as I've already indicated, with much wider things. So this is the image of a broiler shed in Britain that was flooded, and so tens and hundreds of thousands of chickens died. So it's ironic that we're changing the climate in ways that makes extreme weather events more likely, in ways that then feed back into our practice of farmed animals. Thousands and thousands of chickens and pigs were drowned also in the recent hurricane in late 2018 in North Carolina. So these things are coming back on us, and we're developing sort of circles where the unsustainability of what we're doing is becoming clear. It's also really clear that what we're doing intersects with human justice issues as I've described. Those large pig farms that got flooded in North Carolina are awful places to live next to, and they're put disproportionately next to places where black and native peoples live in North Carolina. The state government has reduced the protections for local people in those contexts. So the kind of links between what we're doing to animals and the environmental racism evident in those kinds of policies is another really important issue to attend to. So yes, we need to be attentive to all these complexities, but we also need to recognize that no, it's not more complex than reducing consumption and moving to higher welfare sourcing for animals we're continuing to consume is a really, really important and obviously mandated conclusion to engaging ethically with this topic. So what might be the next step? For me, it's really important to think both individually and corporately in a Christian context. So individually, we might choose to make individual dietary choices. So should Christians be vegan? I think there's really strong reasons to motivate Christians to go vegan on the grounds of concern for animals, concern for the environment, and concern for human well-being. That's an individual choice that is open to each of us. I think it's really important to set that as the sort of goal rather than the sort of immediate demand. Perhaps it looks difficult to make that change all at once, and so thinking about gradual steps like going meat-free 1 day a week, or one meal a day, or just trying out some of the wonderful recipes in the cookery books you can find on those bookstore would be a really good step. But also I'm really keen to encourage Christians to be thinking corporately about these issues. What food gets served in our churches? What food gets served in Christian schools? What food gets served by theological colleges? What food gets served in other Christian organizations? So through my organization, CreatureKind, we're engaged in conversations with about 50 different Christian organizations in the UK and North America at the moment about putting the Christian faith into practice in relation to food policy. So then there it seems that an immediate demand to go vegan all at once doesn't seem an obviously successful strategy, engaging with an institution like a school or a university, but we can make really good steps by helping organizations set strategies to reduce overall consumption through strategies we could advise them on and identify ways of moving to higher welfare sourcing. I'm also looking to get much wider traction for a project that Darryl mentioned called DefaultVeg, which is saying to any organization that does events catering, make vegetarian, vegan catering the default. And if people want to choose meat, they can sort of select a special diet when they're registering for the event. So that both achieves significant changes without provoking the kind of reaction of, oh, you're taking things off the table for me, and also makes this really important philosophical change to plant-based eating as the default and other things being extraordinary. But I hope you get the sense that we ought to be paying serious attention to this abyss between a kind of what a Christian faith in relation to other animals demands and what we're currently doing in relation to our use of animals for food. And I think there are really simple, straightforward, practical responses we can take in response to recognizing that challenge, both individually and corporately. I really look forward to a conversation with you about what we could do together. Thank you.